everybody's heard of grand juries, but I think a lot of people are under the impression that a grand jury works the same way when it's a matter of police misconduct as it does for civilian matter, which it doesn't. And also, I think most people just aren't really aware of the nuances of what a grand jury is, what makes it different from a regular jury, and why it's convened. And can you just kind of break that down for people? Because these things are designed to fail, and I think people need to know how.
Well, depends on who's your definition of failure. So I'll come back to that in a second, though. So grand juries started in this country as a way to keep people from being prosecuted when there wasn't enough evidence against them. It was really a protection initially. So because it was designed as a protection, basically a prosecutor, if they wanted to bring serious charges against a person, the government would require that prosecutor to present their evidence kind of on almost like a preliminary trial type thing, where they would have to present it, and then the judge and or jury, typically a jury, and it's a large jury. In Minnesota, it's 23 members, for example. But basically a jury would hear the evidence and determine if there was enough to even bring charges. And this is really to keep people from having charges brought against them that were fairly baseless and devastating their lives. But it's turned out to be used a completely different way. What they use it for now basically is, and I should go back and say one thing about it. Because it was used in that way, it's not an adversarial process. See, all normal court trials are adversarial. There's a prosecutor, there's a defense attorney, basically in some fashion like that, and the two of them have opposite goals. And so that makes it adversarial, so that you've got two people fighting on two different sides of the same thing. And that's a fairly important dynamic because it helps to keep them in check. So if the prosecutor starts asking inappropriate questions, for example, the defense attorney will object and so forth. So that adversarial process is important because it means that there's at least one person besides the person who's coming under attack by the government who is standing with that person coming under attack. And that's a really important dynamic. You got to have a good attorney that's standing with you, looking out for your best interests. In the grand jury process, because it's essentially a trial or a kind of a rehearsal to see if the prosecutor has enough evidence to bring forward a case, it's not adversarial. In fact, the lawyer for the other side can't even be in, and the person from the other side can't be in the grand jury. They're considered essentially a witness to the grand jury process. So we've seen this be used against activists quite a bit. There's a whole group of folks, I believe it's up to 7 people now, who have been subject to the grand jury for their work in support of Palestine. And so they're, including a number of anti-war activists here in the Twin Cities, where they came, literally raided their houses, the FBI raided their houses, and then they've been subject to a grand jury proceeding. And that's not benign. That's not in any way. And they were commanded to come before the grand jury. All 7 have resisted doing so and have said that they would not do so, but they're subject to being imprisoned at any time for that. So, this is not an adversarial proceeding, and the job that the prosecutor does in those proceedings is only as good as he or she wants it to be. So, for example, in the police grand juries, what happens is they are supposed to be bringing a case against this officer, and they want to put it in front of a grand jury, and they can come in there and they can put forward the weakest case ever. It won't matter. They can really totally stack it. They can stack the grand jury with all white folks who are basically there to, from the countryside, who don't believe police do anything bad or whatever. And this is one of the ways that they stack these grand juries. And because the other side can't see what happens in that proceeding, the defense attorneys or any of that, or in this particular case, let's say, for example, a police brutality case, the family of the person who was harmed by that police officer or killed can't be in there. You don't know if they're doing a good job, bad job, or indifferent. What they're really doing is they're using that grand jury as political cover for not prosecuting that cop. They know they don't want to prosecute the cop. They go in there and they present this real weak case. They're not even trying to get an indictment of this person, and that's what comes out of it is an indictment. They're not even trying to get an indictment of this cop. And so they just go in there and put on a weak case. There was a case, for example, of a guy named Chris Burns. And this guy was, he was involved in a domestic, but he was the victim. And he was basically, and it wasn't even that much of a domestic. He and his significant other were fighting. The children were in the house with them. One of the children got scared and called the police. And within 6 minutes, he was dead. And he was actually the one getting beat up or getting, verbally abused and so forth. And within 6 minutes, they had choked him, yanked his neck back, broke his neck, and killed him, okay, right in front of one of his children and his significant other. There was a grand jury proceeding, and we talked to a guy that was on the grand jury. There were 23 jurors. All of them were white except this guy. And this guy, because he was not white, they made him the foreman of the grand jury, so to speak, the head of the jury members. And they asked to hear the 911 tape when the child had called in. They wanted to hear the 911 tape because they wanted to know what the officers thought the situation was before they arrived. And they asked for it repeatedly. The judge said, no, you can't have it. The prosecutor said, no, you can't have it. And they basically were trying to make a decision on not all of the information. And this guy says, I'm not going along with that. I'm not going to do this. And the guy, the judge said, well, you're going to be held in contempt of court. He said, I am in contempt of this court because this is bogus. This is a bogus process. And basically, they threw him out. They used a substitute, an alternate grand juror, and basically came back, no billing against the cops, no indictment. So these are the processes that are used in large measure by most prosecutors to avoid having to bring charges against cops. It's just a sham mechanism. I will say this, California recently ruled no more grand juries for police cases. Minnesota, our Hennepin County, which is the county that holds Minneapolis, our county prosecutor here said that he won't use them, but at the same time, he did such a rotten job in the case itself, it wouldn't have mattered if he used it or not because he didn't bring charges when he should have. So basically, that's the kind of mechanism that goes on, is that they do these grand jury processes. So now you know a little something about how they operate.
Okay. Now, when you spoke on unions and you spoke on how we can confront unions, do you have any ideas on how communities and organizations can go at this grand jury problem?
Well, for one thing, we should be flooding the prosecutor's office with messages saying no grand jury, demanding that there be no grand juries in these cases, because grand jury, again, is all behind closed doors. It's a secret process designed to let the cops off. So we should always be saying no grand jury. That's unacceptable. In Ramsey County, which is the county that holds St. Paul, they still use a grand jury process. And there was a case here, a man that was killed by the St. Paul police last May. And the family, and it was under very mysterious circumstances, and it was just a really ugly case. And the family found out that the grand jury was going to be held on starting December 21st. So there's two giveaways here. One is, of course, it's going to be harmful to the family for this to be at that time period. This was their very first Christmas without their loved one and so forth. But the second thing is, whenever there's any kind of a legal proceeding that happens right before a holiday, it's because they want it to go real fast. And in grand juries, if it goes real fast, it means they're not going to be looking at very much evidence. And if they're not looking at evidence, then it's a process that's a sham process, right? So we mounted a campaign basically to get people to call the prosecutor and say, no grand jury, but if you're going to do a grand jury, do it after the first of the year. You will not be doing that before the first of the year. Let these people alone, And so we had letters, we had people calling, all kinds of things like that, and they backed off and dropped it before the end of the year. So that was a pretty significant thing. We still say no grand jury, but we don't think we're going to be able to get that quite pulled off in this case. But we did get that pulled off in the Philando Castile case and in the Jamar Clark case. The big question, though, is what did they do after no grand jury. And in the case of Jamar Clark, they just flubbed the investigation to make sure that there were no charges. So, you got to stay on top of these guys every inch of the way.
Right. You really can't let up because they the moment they see a way to gain some ground, they take it, and that's